This course is designed to meet the requirements of Rule 4713-1-14 of the Ohio Administrative Code to provide persons licensed in cosmetology and branches of cosmetology with training on human trafficking. This course will provide licensees with broad information on the subject of human trafficking in the United States and in Ohio. You will learn about the devastating effects of human trafficking on the victims and families involved, how to recognize the signs, and how to report suspected human trafficking activity or victims. This presentation is intended to train licensees to recognize the signs of human trafficking and collaborate with law enforcement to stem the tide of human trafficking in our state.
This presentation is brought to you by the Office of the Governor to raise awareness of the growing problem of human trafficking and its effect on the residents of Ohio.
Human trafficking is happening here in Ohio, but what exactly is it? Starkly put, it's a modern-day slave trade where boys, girls, men, and women are exploited and forced into hard labor or prostitution. You know, I know it may shock you to know that the number of Ohioans being trafficked across our state today could fill a large high school. That's more than 1,000 children every year being exploited in our communities, being snatched, blackmailed, drugged, raped, and forced into the hard labor or the sex trade. Their average age? It's hard to say it, but just 13 years old. Awareness is one of our biggest weapons against human trafficking. It's important to have conversations with your friends, neighbors, and colleagues to spread the word. After all, this modern-day slave trade could very well be happening, believe it or not, right in your community. In 2012, I signed an executive order to take on this fight. Later, I signed legislation that enhances penalties for human trafficking and ensures protection and treatment for its victims. But to really make a difference, we need you. We need your help. After all, these are our children, our family members, and our friends. And it's our responsibility to fight back against this unbelievably terrible crime. Now, you may be asking yourself, if human trafficking is so prevalent, why aren't more folks reporting it? The reality is hiding in plain sight and not easily visible to the untrained eye. In this video, you will hear from human trafficking survivors and learn about their terrible experiences and difficult walk to recovery. You will also learn what human trafficking really means, the grave nature of the problem, and most important in our efforts to fight back, the signs to look out for, and how to help.
Human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, fear, or coercion. The person is then subjected to involuntary acts such as servitude, commercial sex acts, or forced labor. In reality, human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery where people profit from the control and exploitation of others. Sadly, victims often include children involved in the sex trade. Human trafficking is a billion-dollar enterprise. Criminals have begun shifting from trafficking narcotics and weapons to trafficking humans. Drugs and guns must be restocked in order to make a profit, whereas a person is seen as a renewable asset that can be resold time and time again, multiple times in one night. In central Ohio, an estimated 88% of human trafficking involves sex slavery. A majority of victims are runaways. Most victims are under age 18. Many victims come from abusive or substance-abusing families. Victims are recruited from a myriad of locations such as malls, courthouses, schools, social media, and local hangout spots. Teenage girls are rotated among highway welcome centers, annual events, truck stops, hotels, convention centers, or places where there is a large transitory population and the buyers have anonymity. Some may be illegal aliens, but 84% of trafficking victims are U.S. citizens.
My name is Vanessa. I'm from Nelsonville, Ohio. I am not an actress, but there have been times in my past that I wish I was acting. I never imagined that I would be a victim of human trafficking, that I would be tricked, forced, and at times agree to prostitute and solicit for money in order to get the drugs I needed to stay high. The whole time I was getting high, I was trying to hide the scars of my life. Scars from physical and sexual abuse. I was raised in an environment where drugs and alcohol was how everyone dealt with their problems in life. So why wouldn't I do what I learned from the world around me? The pimp, the dope boy, the John, all traffickers, each knows what to look for in people they want to victimize and take advantage of. I had a distorted perception of what loyal was and what love was, and the trafficker exploited my pain for his financial and personal gain at all costs. I was tired of being beaten and battered and down with no self-worth. I was so tired that I just wanted to die. The last time I was out there, I'd been using and up for 8 days. This trafficker, dope boy, grabbed me up by my hair and dragged me down an alley like a caveman. He hit me with a hammer. He took me into this dope house where there was another trafficker with a gun. And at that moment, I realized I didn't want to die. I just couldn't live the way I was living. I couldn't keep dealing with my past with drugs and alcohol. I am no longer a victim. I am no longer a puppet for anyone else. I am strong, courageous, and independent. I am empowered. And now you have an opportunity to help. Learn the signs of human trafficking, whether it's prostitution or people stuck doing hard labor. It may be right under your nose. These victims need your help. Learn the signs. You could help save a life.
Trafficking victims have been groomed to fear police and other first responders, hampering the victim's ability to seek assistance. Due to repeated trauma that trafficking victims endure, they may be subject to long-lasting mental health issues, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and traumatic bonding with the perpetrator. Symptoms can include sleeplessness, nightmares, panic attacks, difficulty concentrating, physical pain, dizziness, hopelessness, suicidal thoughts, hyper-alertness, as well as disassociation. According to the U.S. Department of State Trafficking Report of 2008, about 800,000 men, women, and children, or the equivalent of the entire population of Columbus, Ohio, are trafficked across international borders each year. Annually, up to 17,500 individuals are trafficked into the U.S. from other countries. Approximately 80% of transnational victims are women and girls, and up to 50% are minors. In most cases, the victim is not just abducted off the street. While these situations can and do occur, the majority of victims are lured into the situation through deception. Most incidents start off with the victim getting involved with a personal or romantic relationship with the trafficker. The trafficker then uses various tactics to trap the victim, such as the promise of a good job, love, or marriage. There are two defined categories of human trafficking. Sex trafficking involves prostitution, pornography, stripping, lap dancing, live sex shows, mail-order brides, or child brides. Labor trafficking involves situations such as domestic service, sweatshops and factories, begging, agricultural work, construction, mining, brick kilns, or forced military service. It is generally the result of involuntary servitude or indebtedness to the trafficker. It is estimated by the FBI that 1,078 Ohio children are victims of human trafficking every year. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has identified Toledo, Ohio as a major recruitment site for human trafficking. Toledo ranks 4th in the nation for sex trafficking arrests. 27 cases related to sex trafficking have been prosecuted in the area in just 18 months. Although Toledo is a major focus area, there are stories of sex trafficking that have been brought to light across Ohio. In Columbus, women are forced into sexual activity by a trafficker who pushes drug addiction onto them. In Chillicothe, a 24-year-old woman is lured by 4 men under the guise of partying for the evening to sex trafficking at motels in the Columbus area. In Tip City, police pull over a car with a 20-year-old passenger who tells officers that she is being taken against her will to Indiana to engage in prostitution. In Licking County, a 13-year-old girl is used for prostitution and child pornography material until her traffickers were brought to justice. In Cleveland, a teenage runaway forced to prostitute herself 10 times a day over a month-long period with a total of 200 men is rescued after a sex trafficking ring is brought to light. A 17-year-old girl is abducted at gunpoint from a downtown street and taken to Detroit, where her captors forced her and other girls to have sex with Johns and dance nude in underground clubs. Labor trafficking also is happening all over Ohio every day. The people you see working in what should be honest jobs may be trapped, not receiving pay, and unable to escape. In Springfield, Ohio, a 16-year-old girl from Mexico is held against her will for labor and sex. Her story of domestic servitude emerges only when she is dropped off at a local hospital to give birth. A case out of Miamisburg involves a young man who unknowingly joins a traveling magazine selling crew that was really a labor trafficking operation. The manager refuses to pay him and beats some of the other workers. The young man is forced to work up to 14 hours a day for months, until the manager finally drops him off 1,000 miles from home with only $17. In Mentor, raids of restaurants in the area uncovered dozens of illegal immigrants forced to staff restaurants for long hours with little pay to work off fees and rent. And in Columbus, dozens of women from Eastern Europe are tricked into taking jobs cleaning hotels. The trafficker takes their passports and controls where they live and how they get around. There are several characteristics that make Ohio vulnerable to human trafficking. We have several large urban areas such as Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Toledo. Ohio also has a large transient immigrant population. Numerous major highways cross the state. Ohio's close proximity to the Canadian border assists in traffickers going undetected. With a large population base of over 11 million, it's easier for traffickers to hide in plain sight. In the Trafficking Victims Act of 2000, sex trafficking is a crime in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not yet attained 18 years of age. Pimps who are motivated by the opportunity to make money sell women or girls in the commercial sex industry by using numerous methods to gain control over their bodies and minds. There is a difference between prostitution and sex trafficking. Laws are in place that prohibit individuals from engaging in prostitution. This applies to the buyer, seller, or person promoting the activity. However, these laws apply to people willingly involved in the activity. In trafficking, this is when the seller or prostitute is not a willing participant or has been forced into the activity through force, threat, deception, or other means of coercion. In this case, the person we may view as a suspect becomes a victim. In the United States, sex trafficking occurs in all types of communities, urban, suburban, or rural. Both U.S. citizens and foreign immigrants are victimized. Sex trafficking can take place in settings such as bars, farm work camps, strip clubs, massage parlors, truck stops, or hotels. Victims are promised incentives of good jobs, love, or marriage, and are usually forced into sex work such as prostitution, pornography, and working in strip clubs, and or a combination of labor work like cooking, cleaning, and nanny work. They are physically, sexually, and emotionally abused. Here is a glimpse to the inside of human trafficking from a young female survivor. In Toledo, Ohio, over a 6-month period of time, an older male trafficker pulled alongside her in his car every morning as she walked to school. He bought her small gifts and told her she was pretty. She finally agreed to a ride to school, and she was trapped.
The way that pimp came at me at first, I didn't even know he was a pimp. He came at me like a boyfriend. An older boyfriend, but he cared about me. 6 months later, he told me, "Let's run away together. We can have a beautiful house and family." And I believed him. And we ran away, and then the story changed. And I met the other girls in his stable. And I had to go out every night and work the streets. The alternative was being gang raped by a group of pimps while everyone watched. Tina Front, a sex trafficking survivor.
The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports the average age of recruitment is between 12 and 14 years. In Ohio, the average is 15 to 16 years of age. Victims are recruited from inner cities, suburbs, and small towns. Vulnerability is the common denominator across trafficked youth. In Ohio, over 3,000 youth are at risk, and over 1,000 minors are involved in the sex trade. 90% of runaway juveniles become involved in the sex industry, and within 2 to 14 days, runaways in Ohio are approached by a pimp. 88% of identified human trafficking victims were involved in sex slavery, with 75% being females. Victims of sex trafficking are often recruited from hangout spots, or even friends' or families' houses, shopping malls, courthouses, and juvenile centers, as well as other public places like corner stores and even schools are sources for the trafficker to recruit. Recruitment methods can take several forms. In public, traffickers entice young victims on playgrounds at the mall or on the way to school by providing or promising gifts, a better life, or getting them away from a bad home situation. They may also offer them drugs or alcohol. Girls may be forced to recruit other girls. Recruiters may also take a share of earnings from girls they have recruited. In essence, they move up the chain to get off the streets. Traffickers pose as boyfriends and seduce girls by buying them expensive gifts. They lead the victim to believe this is a true romantic relationship. Once seduced, pimps use torture tactics to control their victims. Such tactics consistently lead to complete obedience and a breakdown of personal independence and autonomy. The pictures on these graphics show branding tattoos used as a way for pimps to brand or own their victim. There is an entire culture with its own vernacular in the world of trafficking that has developed to perpetuate the flow of new victims into its control. This diagram shows the chain of how trafficking victims are recruited. The traffickers are the buyers and sellers of the human commodity, making sex services available to buyers on the street. The bottoms are the primary women utilized by the pimp and may help bring in other victims. Recruiters, groomers, and security are the people who help recruit new victims and keep an eye out for law enforcement or competing traffickers. Groomers help to make the girl feel pretty and show her how to look and act enticing. Connectors and watchers connect the victim to the buyer or John and ensure the girls are performing their job duties. You start from the inner part of the circle, which has the most power, to the outer layers. They all have an important role in making a trafficking operation a success. Although sex trafficking can happen anywhere in the state, some cities face a different challenge with different age groups of trafficking victims. For example, Columbus has the largest number of children who are becoming victims, while Cleveland sees the most adults forced into sex trafficking. Buyers work in a wide variety of employment fields. While some are expected, like drug dealers, others, like social workers, law enforcement, and state employees, can easily be overlooked when trying to identify the problem. Places where sex trafficking may be occurring include adult entertainment establishments, on the roadside sidewalk, over the internet, massage parlors, escort services, hotels, motels, truck stops, and rest areas. The other side of human trafficking is labor trafficking. Labor trafficking, like sex trafficking, involves using force, fraud, and coercion to recruit, harbor, transport, obtain, or employ a person for labor or services in involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. These victims can be found in domestic situations such as nannies, maids, sweatshop factories, janitorial jobs, construction sites, farm work, restaurants, or panhandling. Sometimes people get labor trafficking and smuggling confused because both involve transporting people, but there are differences. Smuggling laws are in place that prohibit individuals from entering the United States illegally. Many people are smuggled into the country on a regular basis. In trafficking, this is where the seller or possibly a buyer force the person to remain under their control after they have entered the country. In this case, many are forced to work off their smuggling debt. Labor trafficking can be found almost anywhere, but some of the most common situations might be farms that use migrant labor, manufacturing locations, ethnic restaurants, agricultural camps, construction, truck stops, rest areas, or nail salons. Human trafficking harms its victims in many ways. The physical harm that can happen can be devastating to the victim. It can include things such as reproductive health problems, exposure to STIs including HIV, pregnancies, abortions, fertility issues, malnutrition, rotting teeth, stunted growth especially in children, alcohol and other drug use, chronic back, visual, or respiratory problems from working in agricultural, construction, or manufacturing in dangerous conditions. But the physical damage is only the beginning. There are numerous psychological implications as well. Mind-body separation, dissociated ego states, other dissociative disorders involving shame and grief, depression, hopelessness, anxiety disorders, self-destructive behaviors including suicide, traumatic bonding with the perpetrator, to name a few. A severe mental illness can develop for many victims called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Symptoms can include acute anxiety, depression, insomnia, persistent flashbacks, physical hyperalertness, self-loathing that is long-lasting and can be resistant to change. In a study of prostituted women from 9 countries, the level of PTSD was 68%, which is the same range as that of treatment-seeking combat veterans. Many barriers to identification exist for people caught in human trafficking. Some are the same between the two groups, and some are unique. Victims of trafficking are unlikely to seek help for a number of reasons. Many victims in the U.S. do not speak English and are unable to communicate with service providers, police, or others who might be able to help them. Often the victim is kept isolated and activities are restricted to prevent them from seeking help. Victims comply and don't seek help because of fear. Victims are also typically watched, escorted, or guarded by traffickers or associates of the traffickers. Very often, traffickers may coach victims to answer questions with a cover story about being a wife, student, or tourist so they can avoid detection. Surprisingly, many are unaware of what is being done to them and that it is a crime. Sometimes victims do not consider themselves victims, or they blame themselves for their situations. And some may develop loyalties or positive feelings toward their trafficker as a coping mechanism. Often victims don't know where they are because traffickers frequently move them to escape detection. Victims are often afraid because they fear for safety of their families after being threatened. After time, victims can develop self-blame and hopelessness, and even a dependency on their traffickers. Some victims may exhibit some or all of the following indicators after being held in a trafficking situation. They are often in the presence of an overly controlling boyfriend or acquaintance. They appear to be malnourished or abused. Victims may have multiple aliases or go by a nickname. Sometimes they demonstrate high levels of fear, anxiety, or nervous behavior. They do not have any form of identification, or another person is in possession of their identification. They claim to be an adult when they appear underage, or they may be traveling with no or few personal effects. They exhibit a lack of knowledge of where they are. Victims may be inappropriately dressed for the weather or the occasion. They may have no explanation of how they got to their location. Other indicators that may be a red flag: a third-party interpreter who always speaks on behalf of the person. The person admits they are in debt to another person, or they claim to be an employee but receive no pay. They are frequently in the company of a significantly older person who is not related. Remember the 4 terms that every victim experiences in their world of trafficking: force, fraud, fear, coercion. Here are some questions to ask yourself when you observe a suspicious situation. Can the person leave their job or situation if they want? Can they come and go as they please? Have they been threatened for trying to leave? Have they been physically harmed? What are their working or living conditions like? Where do they sleep and eat? Do they sleep in a bed, on a cot, or on the floor? Human trafficking has many, 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 many faces.
My name is Vivian. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, and I come from a family that had no boundaries, all secrets, and simply no structure. I was able to run the streets, hang out with older people, and skip school. And this laid the groundwork for me to be taken advantage of and fall prey to people who wanted to use and abuse me. They made me think that they cared, loved, and needed me. I am a victim of human trafficking. Throughout my teenage years, I was in and out of juvenile jails, placed in foster homes, and became a ward of the state. By the age of 18, I had had 2 drunk driving charges. I was addicted to drugs and alcohol and had been arrested several times. This lifestyle made me detached from the world. I had suffered a great deal of emotional and mental abuse. At the age of 29, with the birth of my only child, I was scared that what had happened to me would eventually happen to her. I couldn't give her what I didn't have: true love, which requires no exchange, force, or coercion. I don't want you to go through the pain and the trauma and tragedy that I have gone through. You don't have to feel drained and empty to the point of being spiritually bankrupt. Know that I have received a great deal of help and support to recover and experience true unconditional love today. Don't be afraid to reach out and get help. Today, Ohio finally has a law in the books that can get you the help you need and keep you and your family safe. Help is here for you. Just reach out.
Governor John Kasich is committed to addressing this problem, and on March 29, 2012, he signed an executive order forming the Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force. This report is the result of the work of this task force. The recommendations of the report are designed to work in conjunction with Ohio's recently passed legislation, House Bill 262, the Ohio Human Trafficking Act of 2012, which uses a 3-pronged approach to address the problem of human trafficking. The law recommends raising the penalty for human trafficking to a first-degree felony with a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years. It also creates a diversion program whereby juvenile victims of human trafficking receive protection and treatment through the juvenile justice system. And finally, it allows adult victims of human trafficking with prior convictions of prostitution or solicitation to have their records expunged. Public awareness is the first stop in curbing this human tragedy. This graphic shows the vast disparity in the number of homicides and sex trafficking of minors. The bottom line is that taking personal responsibility to improve your own awareness and to report suspicious activities and situations can help reduce both sex and labor trafficking. To report tips or suspicious activities, you can call the Ohio State Highway Patrol's 24-hour Critical Information and Communication Center at pound 677, or call the Polaris Project, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, at their toll-free hotline, 1-888-373-7888. Using or sharing this information allows you to make a difference in the life of a person enslaved in a world for which he or she has no hope.
Now that you can identify the various forms of trafficking, I hope you'll do your part and be on alert for the signs and spread awareness of this tragedy in our community. It is not exclusive to any one part of our state, and we need to work together as a team to address this terrible problem. I want to make one thing incredibly clear. We've declared war on human trafficking. Please join the fight and stand with us so that we can tell these criminals that if you do this to our kids and neighbors, you're going to find yourself in jail for a very long time. For the victims, please know we're here to help. If you're a victim or suspect that someone you know is a victim, please use the resources provided in this video to seek assistance. We are here for you. Ohio is stepping up to the plate and finally fighting back. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to win.
You have just learned what human trafficking is, the nature of the problem, and the signs of human trafficking. This information is intended to better equip you to be able to recognize and report human trafficking to the authorities. But how does all this information apply to the cosmetology industry? Over the next few minutes, we hope to reinforce your understanding of human trafficking prevention and how you can contribute more fully to Ohio's efforts to eradicate this terrible crime. Additionally, we hope to address some of your questions. On March 29, 2012, Governor John Kasich signed an executive order creating the Human Trafficking Task Force. The Ohio State Board of Cosmetology was asked and was honored to become a member of this task force. The reason the board was chosen to participate was clear. As the second largest board in the state of Ohio, licensing over 140,000 individuals, salons, and tanning facilities, the board and its licensees represent a significant opportunity to reach the public and to recognize victims of human trafficking. In June of the same year, the Human Trafficking Task Force released its first report and recommendations to Governor Kasich. 26 specific recommendations were provided to Governor Kasich, including coordinating efforts to identify and rescue victims, to create a law enforcement system to investigate these crimes, and to provide the services necessary for victims to regain control of their lives. Recommendation number 21 requires that all licensees of Ohio's professional licensure boards complete 1 hour of continuing education on human trafficking. The recommendations of the Human Trafficking Task Force reinforce new law passed in June 2012, part of which strongly recommends that every board, commission, or agency that grants licensure or certification to persons who may encounter human trafficking victims in the normal course of their work promulgate rules to require those persons to receive training in the recognition and handling of human trafficking cases as a condition of receiving or maintaining licensure or certification. Rule 4713-1-14 requires all licensees and students of cosmetology to receive training on human trafficking. This is a one-time requirement, and the hour may be applied toward your continuing education hours for license renewal. The state of Ohio issues licenses to more than 100,000 persons seeking to provide services in the cosmetology industry. Nearly 12,000 salons throughout the state of Ohio provide a multitude of cosmetology, manicuring, and aesthetic services. This represents a very large number of persons and businesses that daily engage consumers throughout the state of Ohio. Annually, the number of persons that use cosmetology, manicuring, and aesthetic services is staggering. Each and every interaction with a customer represents a moment, even if brief, to look for the signs of potential human trafficking. Additionally, each interaction is an opportunity to pass along information to customers so that they too can recognize the signs of human trafficking or seek out additional education to contribute to our efforts to stop this crime. The cosmetology industry is perfectly suited to assist law enforcement in the effort to eradicate this problem in the state of Ohio and to bring those responsible for the abuse of its victims to justice. Human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery. Most often, victims are forced into commercial sex or labor. Victims lose their freedom, their dignity, and often face physical and emotional abuse. The problem exists worldwide, and before you think it doesn't happen here, think again. In 2014, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline reported receiving 21,431 calls, resulting in 5,042 cases in the United States. Of these hotline calls, 164 cases were from Ohio. Sex trafficking involves the use of violence, lies, debt bondage, or other coercion to force women, men, and children into the commercial sex trade. Victims can be physically forced into the sex trade or allured through fraud, deceit, enticements, including money, gifts, or the promise of a better life, or other forms of coercion. Traffickers control victims through physical and mental abuse, sexual assault, confiscation of the victim's identity, money, and isolation from friends and family. Traffickers often rename their victims and sometimes brand their victims with physical marks or tattoos. Labor trafficking involves the use of victims in coerced or forced labor. Victims forced into involuntary servitude through physical restraint, abuse or threatened abuse, harm or serious threats of harm, schemes or threats designed to cause a person to believe that failure to perform would result in harm, restraint, or legal actions against themselves or family. The Polaris Project, an advocacy organization to stop human trafficking and help victims, identifies nail salons among the type of industries that employ victims of labor trafficking. Ohio Revised Code Section 2905.32a states, "No person shall knowingly recruit, lure, entice, isolate, harbor, transport, provide, obtain, or maintain another person knowing that the person will be subjected to involuntary servitude or be compelled to engage in sexual activity." Violators of this law are subject to severe criminal penalties, up to and including felony conviction with a mandatory minimum 10-year prison term. Additionally, sex traffickers are required to register as sex offenders and cannot live within 1,000 feet of a school. Ohio law also provides safe harbor for victims of human trafficking, including services to treat the effects of trafficking and provide eligibility to have criminal convictions removed from their records if they were related to having been a victim of human trafficking. Ohio is not exempt from human trafficking. The Ohio Attorney General's 2014 report on human trafficking reported 85 human trafficking investigations leading to 98 arrests and 17 successful convictions. In Ohio, it is estimated that 88% of human trafficking involves sex slavery. There is no one demographic or stereotype associated with this crime. It can happen in any community, regardless of economics, culture, or ethnicity. Every community is vulnerable. Victims may be recruited at a young age, or may be in, or may have been in, abusive households or in abusive relationships. In 2014, law enforcement identified 181 potential victims in Ohio. Of these, 147 were female and 34 were male. The majority of these cases were sex trafficking. Human trafficking convictions in Ohio demonstrate the severity of this problem. Although these convictions occurred in large cities, evidence shows no demographic is exempt. In many cases, the watchful eye of the public was the difference that brought the matter to the attention of law enforcement. Salon owners are in a unique position to recognize and raise awareness of trafficking, since the business of personal care is common to all members of the public, including the children and young people who are being trafficked. Trafficking is not specific to socioeconomic status, gender, or certain communities. Victims come from many different backgrounds. Look for the signs of human trafficking. The Polaris Project has created a list of red flags. To review these signs in detail, visit www.polarisproject.org. Nail salons have been identified by the Polaris Project as an example of a business in the beauty industry that may be vulnerable to labor trafficking. While the large majority of nail salons have no association with labor trafficking, some are designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of people. Among these are immigrants seeking passage to the U.S. Workers may be trafficked into the U.S. with promises of jobs and opportunity, only to be sold to the sex trade or involuntary labor. Recognizing the signs of labor trafficking is critical to identifying and rescuing victims. Victims of labor trafficking are subjected to involuntary servitude with no wages, limited wages, threat of loss of wages, violence, or being turned into law enforcement or immigration authorities. Often, victims reside on the premises or are transported in groups to the work site. Many workers often live and sleep in small spaces without the opportunity to leave on their own or without supervision. Workers answer casual questions in a manner that appears to be scripted or rehearsed. Workers appear to be exceptionally young, fearful, and particularly submissive. Workers may not make eye contact. Your observations are critical to Ohio's efforts to stop this crime. Public awareness is the first step toward addressing this human tragedy. Knowing and recognizing the signs of human trafficking, who to call, and what to say will help authorities reduce and eliminate this crime, rescue victims, and implement measures to rebuild the lives of those affected by the trauma inflicted by this crime. If you suspect human trafficking activity, it is important to know who to call to report your suspicions. As a citizen of Ohio and as a licensee of the Ohio State Board of Cosmetology, we are asking you to step up and do your part. If you suspect human trafficking, report it. You may save a person from a life of modern-day slavery and give them hope where none existed. In addition, the responsible authorities can investigate and bring perpetrators of these crimes to justice. Feel free to visit the Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force website for more information: www.humantrafficking.ohio.gov. Then, spread the word. Help us stop human trafficking.